Yeah, hello everybody to our course Global Economics, or 1 point for the organization of our trip to Frankfurt. I have also the idea we are going to 4 institutions: the Bundesbank, German Stock Exchange, ECB, and to the one of the largest insurers, Allianz. So maybe you can talk to each other. So it would be nice if we could produce something like a small reader of our trip. So yeah, it will be not a hard task or something like this, but well, if you can write maybe 1 or 2 pages about the institutions where we are going, just describing it, what is it, and maybe we can afterwards also take some photos and writing something what has happened on the trip. And this will be then nice to remember in 5 or 10 years, I think. So yeah, I will give this also in the Moodle course, and then maybe you can split in some groups. I think now we are 12 people coming to Frankfurt, and then if 2 or 3 take of you sticking together and taking one institution, just in order to produce a little reader of this trip. Okay, well, we introduced last time the concept of the Phillips curve. This, yeah, came more or less from our Okun's law, what we were talking about, and then fitting in also prices. So more or less the dependence between unemployment and output is then translated within dependence between inflation and unemployment. And there we saw for US data that, yeah, more or less every 10, 15 years, starting in the 1960s, we had more or less a stable dependence between unemployment and inflation. So what we predicted theoretically, that there's a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. And qualitatively spoken, the mechanism behind is, well, if we are in the business cycle and there is a boom phase, then we are not very surprised that prices will rise, because in a boom phase we have high demand situation, consumers want to buy, and then of course the suppliers, the producers can rise prices. And well, in such a phase also we would expect that unemployment comes down. Well, and this then more or less, yeah, has a political aspect, because then if we know this theoretical dependence between unemployment and prices, then we can say as a politician, well, this is great, because prices we can push by making fiscal policy, making monetary policy in order to push the economy. Well, then we have some inflation, okay, maybe 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or in the 1970s, 70s, in the developed countries, also 2-digit inflation rates of 10, 12%. But anyhow, then unemployment comes down, and we then more or less can, yeah, somehow ride on the Phillips curve, so to speak. pushing inflation, and then we can move upward the Phillips curve. But well, this is highly driven by the expectation of our agents in the economy. Because if you remember, this works only if the actual inflation rate is higher than our expected inflation rate. So we have to be somehow surprised by this rise of inflation. So maybe we expecting 3.5% inflation rate, and then prices increase a little bit more, and this then pushes output, because then the suppliers could sell for a higher price their products, and this of course is then an incentive to increase production, and this then causes lower unemployment. Well, but we are human beings, and hopefully we use our brains, and this means then that somehow, we start to learn. Well, last time there was a surprise. My expectations were wrong. Maybe a second time I'm also surprised. But then we are starting to learn, and this would then mean that our expectations will be better. And this then means that we are, coming back to our so-called natural unemployment rate. And this natural unemployment rate, remember Okun's law, this corresponds to our general framework of our economy. This is how good we are educated, how good is our infrastructure, how efficient is our production in general. But then we are already in this situation of a higher inflation rate because we were surprised. And this then means that we are in a new equilibrium of a higher inflation rate, but still our natural unemployment. And then maybe we can again start to ride on the Phillips curve. But again, we are starting to learn. And this then also from a theoretical standpoint, now introducing some dynamics over time and this learning process within our economy would then mean that in the long run, not this trade-off between inflation and unemployment holds, but this long run Phillips curve, which is just a vertical line. And this you can compare with the long-term AS curve we introduced in macroeconomics in our ASAD model. Compared to the long-run AS curve of the ASAD model. But well, if we go back here to US data and we find a similar picture also for other developed countries in Europe in this time from the 1960s to the 1980s, there we more or less can see that over time from the 60s to the 70s to the end of the 70s to the 80s, we have a quite stable dependence, which it can be explained by our mechanism of the Phillips curve. And if we go then further in time, then we find that more or less this dependence becomes weaker. Here we have an R squared of 0.25, and even in the end of the 90s, there is a switch if we make a regression of our data that even higher unemployment corresponds to lower inflation rates. So this we cannot explain anymore theoretically. Well, and qualitatively, maybe we can explain this by this great disturbance of the breakdown of Soviet Union, and that global economics drastically changed in this time, and all our framework of our economy worldwide has changed. Well, then, with the start of the globalization in the beginning of the millennium, then we see that we have again here from 00 is 2000 a more or less similar dependence due to our theoretical short run Phillips curve. But anyhow, then we have the financial crisis, we had Corona crisis, we had European debt crisis. Still, there is not such a stable dependence due to the concept of the Phillips curve, like these first 30 years after World War II. So in this example, we then more or less see that we always have to go to the data after we introduce a theoretical concept which seems logical. We have to go to the data and look what is in reality. Do we find these circumstances we are predicting with our theoretical models? And well, sometimes I have to admit that me and my colleagues, that economists somehow for themselves, we more or less decided, well, this is a very good model because I have understand it, and I think this is the best model to describe reality. And then I'm, for the next 10, 20, 30 years, always telling the same story. And yeah, for me, I have to admit that I think that the circumstances change that much also within a decade that we always have to keep in mind to look at the descriptive data, and is it still possible to describe reality with my model, where I am convinced that this is the model how it works. Yeah. So in order to summarize this part of the Phillips curve, if we want to write on the Phillips curve, then always the actual inflation rate has to be higher than the expected inflation rate. But this, of course, we have to admit, is an unrealistic assumption because of the general learning process. And actually, if we take then the concept of Homo economicus, the rational altruistic utility maximizer, and if we then on average assume that we act rational, then we have to admit that more or less this concept of the long-term Phillips curve would hold, that inflation will be in the neighborhood of the expected inflation, and this then will mean that we come again to an economy which is more or less supply driven from the circumstances. That in general, we are always around the natural rate of inflation. And if we then, via economic policy, we still try to ride on the Phillips curve, then this will cause only inflation. And then we have this situation that we have a situation of stagnation because we are at the natural rate of unemployment. But due to our pushing process, we have the rise in prices, and this we then call stagflation. And yeah, we have seen this kind of stagflation in the end of the 1970s, and maybe we have seen something like this also in the aftermath of Corona, when and before the war in the Ukraine started, because then also the prices started to rise. Because we had still this very weak monetary policy, but from the circumstances in the world, due to our shortage in resources in computer chips, if you remember, in 21. So we couldn't change or we couldn't increase production, but we were still pushing our economy. And then also before the start of the war in Ukraine, prices really started to rise, and we there had already inflation rates of 4-5%. So still also although the we see in the data that there is maybe only a weak dependence due to the concept of the Phillips curve, still I think we could apply this concept in order to explain situations we had just 2 years ago. Okay, with this I now want to end this introduction into dependence between unemployment, output, and prices. And now we will come, to some descriptive part where I just want with you together to look also in a historical context. We will start with data also from the 1980s, how dramatically the world changed during the last 40 years. And for this, I brought you the data for economic growth of the world. So the orange line here, this is world GDP. And this is world trade data. And you see, this is just the nominal development in trillion euros. Well, and this is, how we just start in such a situation. We look at the data and then producing some diagram. And, well, let's try to see anything. And if you look just at this diagram, what would you say, what we can see? Any idea? Just try to describe this diagram. Yeah. Yes, so we can say we qualitatively we see more or less a similar pattern. Also, what we see here. Do you know what this kink is and what this kink is? Yeah. Yes. So these both are financial crisis, and this is Corona. Do you have an idea what this could be? Because we also have a kink. Actually, I don't think that you could know these. This is just only due to since we are measuring here in US dollars, this was really a large depreciation of US dollar. So in the nominal data here, we had also a loss in GDP, but this was no real loss. This was only a loss due to the case that the US dollar depreciates against more or less almost all other important currencies in the world. So this was only a depreciation of the US dollar versus almost all other important currencies in the world. For this, also one has to be careful when we look at these data. Yeah. Well, there was in this time, the labor market was, not that good within the US, and this is maybe also an explanation that after the European debt crisis, also there was a question what happens especially to the Eurozone. And then in 2014, 2015, also, it was clear that there was more stability within the Eurozone. And so maybe this was then the reason that the euro, especially the euro, appreciates against the US dollar. Well, but if you remember my macro course, it is always the case if you look at the development of free floating currencies in a perspective of decades, that you always can have a volatility of 10, 20, or 30 percentage points between the currencies. And there is not always a really definite explanation what has happened in this free floating process. So this is actually no real surprise that something like this happens. Yeah, but if you look at this diagram, then we see that qualitatively, we have the same pattern in the development of trade and production, but what is with the quantitative relationship? Well, if you look at these numbers, which parameter rise faster? Do you have an idea? If you just look at this diagram, could you see something? Or do you have an idea? Well, I also have to admit it is hard to see because we are starting here at a much lower point. This is about 1 trillion or something like this, and then even here, I don't know if I have grown faster than production or not, because here I see maybe production until the start of the millennium has maybe doubled. Is this also a double? I don't know. And for this, yeah, we have to manipulate somehow the data. And yeah, if you want to redo it, the IMF data mapper, I also already introduced for you. And what I now found is a very good site also at IMF. And maybe you can use this also for your term paper. You can click on this and there you find especially trade data. Hopefully this works. Yeah, and here you find the trade data, especially here in direction of trade statistics. And if you click on this, you come directly to the trade page, and here you find exports and imports, and especially what is interesting afterwards by areas and countries. So there you can find really good data when you want to know who is the largest trade partner of your country or something like this. This will open in a minute, hopefully, because I'm streaming. I opened the Zoom meeting, camera recording. Hopefully the processor will do it. Actually, I think this data set is better, even better than these International Trade Center, which I recommended for you in order to just look at this regional dependence. While in this International Trade Center, ITC, you will find also the dependence on different products. This you don't find here. So here, then you see exports. Here we have imports, and here you can put in years, quarters, time. But always if you change something here, this I learned also too, is you have then at first go to auto update, that it really takes the changes which you have made here, and it always takes some time also. And then here you can change to different countries and so on. And then here you see this is in now world, and now you see to almost all countries, 150 or something like this you find here. So I really recommend this data set, and I'm quite happy that I found it just last week. Okay, so then I downloaded the data for world GDP and world trade. World trade, for world trade, then I just used, since until now we have only one Earth, and then there are exports and imports of the world. Well, if we are not exporting to Mars, then of course exports and imports has to be the same on a global and in a global way. In the data, you find a discrepancy between exports and imports. This is due to problems in the statistics. And for this, then I just added up exports and imports and divided it by 2 in order to get a number for world trade. So what you also can do is then you can click in within this part in the slides. But since I had always problems when I directly manipulated data within this implementation of Excel within PowerPoint, quite often then my computer freezes. I don't know why. And therefore I copy this data and open it directly within Excel. So, well, and now let's at first reproduce the diagram. World trade and world GDP, and this is in trillion US dollar. Well, and now if we want to see which time series is maybe growing faster, then we introduced also already in our macro course the concept of an index. So what we can do is that we set both time series at the starting point in 1980 to 100, and then just moving onwards relatively to this number of 100. So this would be then the index of world trade and this index of world GDP. So I then could just write within this box a 100, but then I want to know if 1.5 equals to 100, what is then 1.64? And therefore I directly calculate within these 100 with a formula. So what I then do is 150 over my starting point, 150, and then I want to move on relatively to this 150. So I have to divide by this 150, but afterwards I have to divide every number by 150. And therefore I fix this, and this you can do in Excel in a simple way with F4. Pressing F4 means then that you see here that I have $2 in front of B and 3, and this means then that this fixes the cell. And I want to have this number at 100, so I just multiply it by 100. And if I go now down to the next cell, clicking within here, oops, sorry, I have to go here, then you see that you just manipulate the data by 164 divided by 150 times 100. And then you know that 164, if 150 equals 100, then 164 equals 108.9. Well, and this formula, then I just can copy to the right. And now I have to be careful, since I fixed the 150, the 1.5 in this cell, I have to move here also from B to C. Going down here and then until the end. Well, and then since I have this already, I can just copy this, and then you can just move this to the right and this to the left, and then you have just read in the data of the two other time series now with the index 1980 equals 100. Well, and now what you see, and maybe, oops, you are a little bit surprised, because in US dollars, the blue line seems to be a little bit flatter than the orange line. That especially here in the starting point in the year 2000, more or less, until the year 2000, from 1980 to 2000, world trade and world GDP moved more or less quite parallel, or even in the same way if we have manipulated the data to starting point 100 in 1980. But then, and this is more or less then the starting of globalization. Here, in the aftermath of the breakdown of the Soviet Union, you can say that maybe Eastern Europe resettled, the countries started, especially Poland, started then to trade with all other partners. We have now the private sector in the former communist country, which has been developed within these 10 years from 1990 to 2000. And then, of course, with the year 2000, with very powerful China started to step into the world market. And here then you see that in the first decade of the new millennium, that world trade moved much faster than world GDP. Then we have here again the financial crisis. And here then you have again this kink. This is only the depreciation of the US dollar. But if we look at this data then more or less on average, we have a parallel movement of world trade and world GDP. Well, this is maybe just seen looking at this diagram, and in order to verify what we see here, then you could start and calculate just the growth rates of your two time series. So then VT and growth and world GDP growth. Oh, and how to calculate growth is just the value in 1981 over the value in 1980 minus 1. And of course, it doesn't matter if you use the nominal values in US dollar or if you use the index, because index was just only manipulated in the relative way. So, and going down here, and let's also put this in growth rates. Well, and now, we can look again at these numbers. Again, we can just move if it works. So on this side, and here we want to have growth rates. Oh, this you can't see though. Go just here, and here you can change it to percentage. Well, and also 25 to 30 is enough. This you can manipulate 25 to 30. Well, and what we see now here is what we already also have shown in a qualitative way in the other diagram, that until 2000, the orange line and the blue line are still lying on each other more or less. And then you see here in this period from 2000 to 2008 until the financial crisis, there you really have this push of globalization, that almost the international trade have grown with a factor of 1.5, and sometimes even the growth rate doubled. world production. And there you really see that the world became much closer in this time. And then you see the turmoil of the financial crisis. And then again, the orange line and the blue line, the growth rates are lying again more or less on each other. So we have again this parallel movement, like from the 1980s to 2000. And what we also see, on average, the growth rate is only half of the growth rate of GDP which we had in the first decade of the 2000s. Okay, so let's maybe just put these diagrams also within here. And this one. So what we then see here, oh, this was the wrong diagram. We want to have this one here. No, again, the wrong one, sorry. So this one we need. So here, taking the index 100, 100 equals to the year 1980. We see here the start of globalization. And if we then go to the growth rates, oh, this I have also not changed. Here we need growth rates. That we have here. Same growth rates of world trade and world GDP. In this case here, in the first decade, world trade growth almost doubled world GDP growth. And here, after financial crisis, again, we had parallel growth for world GDP and world trade, and growth rates were on average only half of the first decade of the millennium. Well, and one last manipulation I want to show you. What you also can do is, I think I can click in here. No, can I click in here? Yeah. There you can format also the axis. Oh, this you don't see within here, so I do it in Excel. This is another possibility if you don't want to do this manipulation due to the in order to go to the index. You can also manipulate the axis here. Sorry. So then this has to be somewhere else so that you see this. And here you have the possibility to change the axis to a log scaling. And what does it mean if you go to the log? Then you more or less see the growth rate. Think of the exponential function, e to the power of x, and if you take the log, then you just obtain x. So log of exponential function is x itself, and then you, so to speak, just see the growth rate. And here, if you go to this log scaling, and now we have, I think, the, where is it? Where's the log? Here. So I have 10, so you can also take the natural log. This is 2.7. Oops. Do you see this? Yeah. 2.71. Then you see also that the blue line is much steeper than the orange line just here in the beginning of the millennium. So this is then also one possibility. Let's try this also. Or at first, in order to get this diagram too, because I will give you also the Excel file. Log, or we can also use the 10 log. So this will be then, no, it's still trillion, this is okay. So let's put this here. So here we have the log scale. And yeah, what you can also do is, as I showed you before, is just to fit in here a trend line. Now, in a minute, we do not want to fit here a linear line because this is a growth process, and therefore we would choose exponential, and for the blue line too. and also the numbers. And let's put this also in here. And we take this and this. And what we see then here is, here we have a growth rate on average of 5.5 and almost 7% on average for world trade. So, and the last point I want to show you how to manipulate in order to get, these difference in the interesting periods. Here, then of course, well, it's 9:30, then let's do it. You could of course also calculate the average growth rates for these different periods, and then you see that you have here around 15% growth rate and 7 or 8% within the first decade of the 2000s. Okay, but you had a question? Mm-hmm. Just became so in the start here around 2000. This we will then mainly see on Thursday in our next lecture. In the year 2000, if I remember it right, China GDP was almost the GDP of Italy. So but we can start with this. So, because we have still 15 minutes left. Because now this is just the description. Well, and then, as you already mentioned, then we have some idea what could be the reason for this. Well, and then I already said we had the breakdown of the Soviet Union. The first 10 years, if we look at Germany especially, then we had at first still to incorporate the GDR within our country, and this, of course, took much longer than we at first thought. And also, if we take Eastern Europe, all the countries there, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, and so on, former Yugoslavia, there always was this transformation process. And this took also at least 10 years for former Yugoslavia, even longer because of the war which started then there. But then maybe we can, on a qualitative way, we can say after 10 years, then more or less we had there functioning economies, and also China started to function in a global way. And then we had really that global trade, so to speak, started, and not only the developed countries, Europe and United States, Canada, and so had large trade volumes. But then, we have to go, so to speak, into the regions, which were the main, who were the main drivers of these, and 15% per year. This is really a very fast growth of international trade. And for this, then I divided the world in 3 or 4 regions. And here you see the data for European Union. Oops, my mouse is there. And European Union is European Union today. So the 20 the European Union today, although we are starting in the 1980s, if we have, so to speak, for Slovakia and the Czech Republic didn't exist in the 1980s because we had Czechoslovakia as one country, so we just take the data which we have for Czechoslovakia, and so to speak, we tried to calculate these data, although these countries didn't exist for this time. But yeah, this more or less works, and so we take the European Union backward, although the European Union didn't exist in these times, or didn't exist with these countries we have right now. Then, of course, the United States and China. And yeah, if we start here today with a nominal GDP, then you really see here again China was really a very small, in quotation marks, economy compared to USA and the aggregate of European Union. So as I mentioned, I think it was in 2000, China GDP approximately had an amount of the GDP of Italy. And then you see here this very steep increase of China. Well, but also what you see here in the beginning of the new millennium, we see even that the increase of nominal GDP of the European Union increased much faster than the US. And this maybe we can also qualitatively explain, because then especially Eastern Europe started to emerge. So in this phase, we also could say that, yeah, whole Eastern Europe, with Poland, with Hungary, with Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, and Czech Republic, and so on, that these were also some kind of emerging markets, because they came from the communist time and they really had to rebuild their countries. So also EU growth was much higher than US growth. So, and this is then, yeah, more or less a regional explanation. Where does this large increase of world trade came from? Well, of this push, especially in these first 10 years of China and also of the European Union. And then unfortunately, we see after the financial crisis that European Union more or less stagnated, while the US performed much better. But again, you have to be careful um, because we have still here the nominal GDP, and in general, if you remember this, or if we go to the time series, especially if we look at the exchange rate between euro and the US dollar, then just before the financial crisis, we had an exchange rate of 1.6 euro versus US dollar, and then it came down even to parity. So $1 is 1 euro, and right now we are around 1.1, 1.2. So we had then, on average, excluding this a special phase in 2015-16, where we had also a depreciation of the US dollar, but in general, after the financial crisis, we had in general a depreciation of the euro versus the US dollar of 20 or 30%. And this is, of course, also one main explanation that we have measured in US dollar as stagnation of GDP, but the EU in real terms, of course, also increased. But I don't want to go into too much detail, and therefore I didn't show you here the real growth rates, because in order to, when we look then at exports and imports, and there it is, quite hard to find aggregated data in order to get rid of the price effect when you look at trade data, because if you remember this I mentioned hopefully also in my macro course that export and import prices are much more volatile. There you have always fluctuations of 10 or 20% within a year. And also, in order to get the aggregate for the EU, there we have very much intra-EU trade between the countries. And therefore, this canceling out price effect is not that easy. And therefore, I took here the only the nominal data. And what I also did, and there you have to be careful, but this we will then do on Thursday, is that I looked here only at extra EU trade. So I consolidated the data that I didn't look at the trade between France and Germany, because if you just only sum up all these data, then you would come to the point that EU trade is, I think, about 60 or 70 of the trade volume of the world. But this then includes all intra-EU trade between France, Germany, France, and Spain, and so on. But then, of course, if you would compare this, then you would have also to compare the trade between California and New York. And this is some lack. If you look at some other studies or papers, then mostly the data is not consolidated only to extra EU trade. But on this pattern, we will come to this then on Thursday. And if you look already into the slides, then I will also try to explain what we have seen here, that especially also after the financial crisis, why didn't we came back to this globalization push after this? And for this, I want to make some case study with you that I want to explain this in a game theoretical way. So my question is, have you did at least some game theory, maybe in microeconomics and in some business administration courses? So you have already heard from the concept of Nash equilibrium? Okay, great. Because also, this I also want to show you is, where did I have it? Here. I started here. I will just sum up. We already had Okun, we had Phillips curve, and so on. And here I gave you these papers we were talking about, and you can also read about these economists. And then here is also the Nash concept, and yeah, maybe for Thursday you can remember what you have already done in game theory. Okay, so thank you very much for today.